Good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're learning Maseches, Gittin, Daf Pei Gimel. We are starting at the two dots about 10 lines down at the Tanu Rabbanu. Today we're going to do a deep dive analysis on the Shita of Rabbi Eliezer that we learned yesterday. Rabbi Eliezer yesterday in the beginning of our Mishnah, at the beginning of the Perek, had a very unique Shita. And if you flip back to Pei Beis Amud Aleph just for a moment, the open of the Perek will help us for today's daf. The case was Hamagarish es ishto, that if a man was to divorce his wife, and while he was handing her the get, Amar lo, he said to her, Arat muteres l'chol adam elo leploni. In our divorce, you will then be allowed to marry anyone in the world except for person X. And Rabbi Eliezer had said in our Mishnah Matir that she was then allowed to marry all but that person, namely, the divorce was effective with the exception of, let's say, Shimon, whoever the case may be. Now, that's a very difficult shita. And the Gemara and this Brisa tells us that after Rabbi Eliezer died, the Tanaim went to town. They couldn't handle his shita. They were polite when he was alive. And says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan la'achar p'tiraso shel Rabbi Eliezer, after he died, nichnasu arba'a zakenim leheshiv al dvaro. Four of the greats, as we will soon see who they are, these four great people, these four great Tanaim, sat down to say, now that he's died, I have to say, I don't understand what he was talking about. Who are these people? Let's see, in order. Number one, Eluhain, Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. Sounds like a nice chevra from like the Haggadah. So it's the Pesach chevra. So clearly they got together more than once. And over here, they were here to lay an attack of sorts against Rabbi Eliezer. Now, let's just say, Balabatish, it is difficult to understand the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. If you make a condition of a divorce, that you're allowed to marry anyone in the world except for one person, how does that function as krisus? How does that function as a proper separation? How does he have any control over her after a divorce is instituted? So that's just a basic balabatish challenge to Rabbi Eliezer. And these four Tanaim have very, very deep and bigger concerns, but I'm just expressing basic terms why Rabbi Eliezer's shita is difficult. So let's jump in one at a time. We're going to learn all four shitas, and then we're going to analyze all four shitas. Here's shita number one, 12 lines down. Nene Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon gave a response to Rabbi Eliezer's shita. Ve'amar, he said as follows, I don't understand. Harei shahal chazu v'niseis le'achiv shel zeh she'asra alav. Let's say that let's say the husband said to Rachel, you can marry everyone in the world but Chaim. And she doesn't marry Chaim, but she marries Chaim's brother. She had forbidden her from marrying Chaim, and then she went to go marry Chaim's brother, whose name is Yaakov. She married Yaakov, and Yaakov died without children. And guess what? Then she falls to Yibum, to the person who the husband said she's not allowed to marry. Says the Gemara, Lo nimsa zeh oker davar min Torah. Isn't this a challenge, says the Gemara? Says the Gemara against Rabbi Eliezer. If he says that Chaim is usher to marry, so then an avla has happened in Klal Yisrael, that she's not allowed to marry even the brother of Chaim, because if she marries the brother of Chaim and the brother dies and she has no kids, then she's not allowed to marry Chaim. Chaim was ushered in the original deal, and therefore, halamadet she'ein zeh krisus. That's answer number one. I should say argument number one. That's Rabbi Tarfon. By the way, it's interesting to note that the four people are presented in the initial list in a different order than they're presented over here. So just, although you'll see a correction on the side, I have in the Hagos V'Tzionim, it says over here, it should have been Rabbi Tarfon first and then Rabbi Yossi Haglili. So was this on purpose? Was it not on purpose? Fine, let's continue. Then the Gemara says, Nene Rabbi Yossi Haglili ve'amar. Rabbi Yossi Haglili piped up and he said, I have another reason why I don't like the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. Heichan matzinu aser lazeh u'muter lazeh. Where do we have a scenario that a woman is allowed to marry person X, but she's not allowed to marry person Y? After all, it should be that ha'aser lakol, that if she's not allowed to marry a man, she's not allowed to marry any man. V'hamuter muter lakol. And if she is allowed to marry any man, then she should be allowed to marry any single man. Why is it that over here there is seemingly this oddity that she's allowed to marry most men, just not Chaim? So says the Gemara, halamadit, that says Rabbi Yossi Haglili, it must therefore be she'ein zeh krisus, that this is not considered krisus. Let's learn the third shita. This shita is going to become quite important, as we'll soon see. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah Amar Krisus Tavar HaKares ben Olevina. The pasuk says Krisus v'chasav la sefer Krisus, that there has to be a severance between her and him. Halamadid. What do we see from here? By virtue of the fact that in the case of Rabbi Eliezer, he said that they're divorced with the exception of Chaim. That's not a full severance. As we can see, there's still some tethering between the Isha and her Baal, in that she's not allowed to marry Chaim even after the divorce. So says the Gemara, Halamadid she'ein ze Krisus. That's shita number 3. And shita number 4 is really Rabbi Akiva, 2 versions of Rabbi Akiva, which will be a total of 5 shitas. So it's Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. What
was the case we just said? Rabbi
Elazar ben Azariah was bothered by the fact that this isn't krisus. Why isn't this krisus? Because a krisus is a full severance between the husband and the wife. But here there's a lingering non-severance in that she's not allowed to marry Chaim. So if the husband has any hold over the wife after the divorce, that's not a full krisus. That's why he says Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah is a very difficult shita. And then a third of the way down, 4 lines before the wide lines, Rabbi Akiva v'Amar, he said, I have a different problem than all of you. Says the Gemara, let's say she goes to marry someone, and and then she had children with that person. So she married a random guy. Let's call him David. She goes into the shuk, she gets married, a nice Jewish guy. They start dating, they get married, have a couple of kids. And then and then she became widowed or v'niskarsha, and then she got divorced. And then v'amda v'niseis lazesha asra shenesra alav. And then after a marriage with a bunch of kids, she goes and marries the one guy that was the condition of who she should not marry, which is Chaim. So it says the Gemara, lo nimtzeis gedpat bate aluvaneha mamzerin. Let's talk about a flow of events. Rachel used to be married to Ruvain. When Ruvain was divorcing Rachel, he said, we're divorced and you can hereby marry everyone except for Chaim. No problem. She goes and marries David and has 3 kids. David dies or they get divorced, and then she goes and marries Chaim, the guy that she's not allowed to divorce, not allowed to marry. So if she marries Chaim at any point, she has broken the condition of her get. And therefore, retroactively, the children that were born to David are mamzerim. Because she broke the condition of her get. She broke the condition of her get, and therefore she's not divorced, because her get is only chalaf. The condition is fulfilled.
It becomes
retroactive mamzerus with the children that she had, that Rachel had with David. So the flow of events is that she was married to Ruvain. They got divorced with the condition that she can't marry Chaim. She married David, fine, no problem. Had 3 babies, no problem, great, everything is good. And then she Yetzer Hara took over for her after she got divorced from David. She went and married the guy she wasn't supposed to marry, which was Chaim, which was a break of the condition of the get. Guess what? Her get doesn't count anymore. And therefore, looking back, if the get was a 0, then the babies she had with David are mamzerim. Halamadit, first of the long lines, she'ein ze krisus. That's not krisus.
Johnny, show.
What?
Johnny, show her what she wants.
Yeah. It's the Maury Povich show, you know?
Yeah.
She's married 3 people in a short time, and now all the kids from the middle marriage are all mamzerim. Why do you look upset about that?
I totally disagree, but Rabbi Akiva is better than I, of course.
I think that's a fair statement, and I like you, but he's still better than you are. But we'll see that almost all of these shitas are going to get rejected. Almost all of them. All of them have chesronos in their logic, and that's what we're going to spend time digging into. And on the first of the long lines is davar acher. This is version 2.0 of Rabbi Akiva. We just learned the case of Rabbi Akiva, the case of Ruvain, followed by David, followed by Chaim. Here it's different. Davar acher, hare shahayazeh shenesra alav kohen umeis hamegarish. Let's say the person that she's not allowed to marry, this Chaim guy, is a Kohen, Umeis HaMegarish, and the husband, Ruvain, died. Lo nimtzeis almona etzlo. Is it not the case that as it relates to the Kohen, she's an almona, ugrusha etzel kol adam, and she is a grusha as it relates to anybody else?
I'm saying I'm not following this.
Mm-hmm. Well, if it makes you feel any better, I sometimes feel the same way. Let's do it again. First of the long lines. Let's say that when Rachel and Ruvain got divorced, Ruvain said you can marry anyone on planet Earth except for Chaim. Turns out Chaim is a Kohen. And then Umeis HaMegarish. So the man she's not allowed to marry, Chaim, the Kohen, is alive and well. And then Umeis HaMegarish, Ruvain then died after this took place. Lo nimtzeis, is it not the fact that she is an almona etzlo? She's an almona as it relates to the Kohen, ugrusha etzel kol adam, and she's considered a divorcee as it relates to all people. V'kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Says the Gemara halfway down. Uma grusha shehikala, just like by a grusha, where the isser of marrying a grusha is, relatively speaking, a low-level isser. Asura bishvil tzad gerushin sheba, and the isser is based on the fact that she, as a grusha, is not allowed to marry a kohen. And Eishes Ishi Chamura Lokol Shekain. All the more so in a case of Eishes Ish, which is so strict, if there is an Eishes Ish component to her, she shouldn't be able to marry anybody. Halamadit She'ein Zeh Krisus. The Rishonim struggle with this too. Gerald, you're not the only one. And the Gemara says that this is the case scenario where this is version 2.0 of Rabbi Akiva, where he says that based on this Kal V'chomer, we see that there really is no krisus when he maintains a little bit of a hold over his wife after the divorce, by saying that she can marry everyone but Chaim. So then, after all of these shitas, we're still really, we're not formally in the Brisa because there's a lot of back and forth here. Maybe we are still formally in the Brisa, actually. Could be that we're still in the Brisa. Anyway, says the Gemara, 4 lines into the wide lines, Amar Lahen Rabbi Yoshua, Ein Mishiven Es Ha'ari La'achar Misa. You cannot fight against the lion after he's died, which of course is a little bit of a nice.
Why didn't they ask him before he died? This is my question.
Say there. You're asking good, but they didn't. Maybe he was too great. I don't know. But the Gemara says that in the name of Rabbi Yoshua, you guys, none of your arguments hold water. Nothing. Why not? We don't fight with the lion. He knows more than you do. Now, all of that is in the times of the Tanaim. A couple of 100 years later, Amar Rava says, 5 lines into the wide lines, Kulhu, all of the shitas that we just saw, 5 approaches, 4 of them, 3 of them to one person, 3 of them, one's Rabbi Tarfon, and who was it? Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and then Rabbi Akiva had 2 shitas. It says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Kulhu, in all cases, Islahu Pircha, I could undermine the arguments against Rabbi Lazar in all cases. Lebarmi de Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah de les la Pircha. Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah was the one who says that this is simply not called krisus. He was the simplest answer. It's not called krisus if the husband still has a hold over the wife. So if the husband says you're hereby divorced with the exception of Chaim, that's holding on to the wife after death. You're not allowed, after divorce, you're not allowed to do that. That's krisus. And that was the only answer that held up to the test of time. All the others have been removed. Where do we see this? Tanya Nami Hachi, the Brisa writes this. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Roe Ani es Divrei Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah midivrei Kulan. Period.
Okay, which shita held up the test of time?
Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's shita is found 6 lines before the wide lines. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, krisus is what the Torah wrote, Davar HaKoris ben Olevena. But when the krisus is not complete, when the krisus is a krisus of condition, where he says you're divorced, you're hereby divorced for everyone on planet Earth with the exception of Chaim, so then the Gemara says that's not called krisus. He was the simplest answer of them all and the hardest to argue. That's what the Gemara says. Now, Amar Mar, we're going to go through all of these answers that we just learned, all of the arguments against Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and raise the questions that reject their thoughts. So we have our Shita Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. We have the 5 approaches in the Tanaim as to why they don't like Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. We're going to undermine all of them. That's what we're doing now. So we're about 2/3 of the way down at the 2.78 lines into the wide lines on Pei Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara continues. Amar Mar. We had learned in the beginning of the Brisa at the top of this page, toward the top of this page, Ne'ene Rabbi Tarfon v'Amar, he had argued that if the woman decided to marry the husband of Chaim, she married the brother of Chaim, she married David. What did I say? I said his name was Yaakov last time. And then Yaakov dies and she has no kids, then she falls b'yibum to Chaim, the man she's not allowed to marry. So says the Gemara, what do we see from here? That Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah in his Shita, he was Oker Davar Min Torah. That because he said that she can't marry Chaim, then when she marries Chaim's brother Yaakov, and Yaakov dies and she has no kids, she falls to Yibum to Chaim, but she can't marry Chaim because Chaim was assered in the condition of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Eliezer, it must be that Rabbi Eliezer is wrong because he's being Oker Davar Min Torah. He has ruined a case of Yibum. Says the Gemara, Oker. Rabbi Eliezer, he wasn't Oker anything. Ihu Akar, he didn't do anything wrong. What's the big deal? Ella, you're right. Matana, Ella Masna, la Akar Davar Min Torah. He made a condition that led to something that was being Davar Min, that was being Oker Davar Min Torah. Because he said she can't marry Chaim. And then this woman went along and married Yaakov, who was Chaim's brother. So led to this indirectly. Says Gemara, Masna, he didn't make a condition. She didn't have to marry Chaim's brother. The planet is filled with people. Why does it have to be that she has to marry the brother of the one guy? Says the Gemara, Mika Amarla, did he say to her, Lo Saki la gavra? I'm only saying that you should marry the brother of Chaim. He didn't say that at all. Ela gorem la'akor davar min haTorah. Must be that he indirectly caused that there was some type of akiras davar min haTorah, that Yibum can't take place. Says the Gemara, Gorem, what kind of cause are you talking about? Elameata, if that's true, then Bas Achiv Lo Yisa. Beautiful argument. The Gemara was trying to say that if you're trying to argue that Rabbi Eliezer did something wrong by saying that she can't marry Chaim, but then she's allowed to marry Chaim's brother Yaakov, and if Yaakov dies, she falls to Yibum. If you're saying that that's a problem, then you should also say that a man can never marry his brother's daughter, which is definitely not true.
But this is only with the stipulation what you can marry anybody but this person.
It's true. That's a very fine distinction, Michael. But the truth is that the construct should be the same. Because if what we're saying is that we're concerned that she may fall to Yibum to someone who's usher, then how can I ever marry my niece? Hare, she would then fall to her father if I died. Right? So then that's what the Gemara says. Shema yamas below banav gorim la'akor davar min haTorah. Hainu pircha, says the Gemara. This is the question that ruins the shita of Rabbi Tarfon. So one up, one down. We started with Rabbi Tarfon, and we've asked and answered this question in such a way that there is no question anymore. And says the Gemara, uvemai. This question is not clear on its face. It's clear from the continuation of the Gemara. But really what the Gemara is asking is a question that we asked the other day, is that when our Mishnah says that at the open of the Perek, that Hareat muteres l'chol adam ela leploni, does ela mean chutz or does ela mean almanas? So the Gemara says, when Rabbi Tarfon had given his understanding of Rabbi Eliezer, his argument against Rabbi Eliezer, did he assume that Rabbi Eliezer's case was a case of chutz or a case of almanas, going back to yesterday's sugya? So says the Gemara, Ilema bachutz, if you want to say that it just means except for, and it's not a condition, it's just a fact. So then Mishra Shari Rabbi Eliezer, then there's a case scenario where he's being very lenient. Titania, Mode Rabbi Eliezer, there is a case where Rabbi Eliezer does allow for this marriage to take place. Where is this? Mode Rabbi Eliezer, b'magarish es ishto, if a man is divorcing his wife, v'amar lani says to her, Hared muteres l'chol adam chutz miploni. You're allowed to marry everyone but Chaim. She went to the shuk, she married Yaakov, and Yaakov, the guy in this story, divorced her or died. After that, she's then allowed to marry even the initial person that she was aser. So that's what the Gemara says, that if you say it's a case of chutz, then Rabbi Eliezer would allow for this marriage because it's not a condition. Ella, it must be that Rabbi Tarfon's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer was Ella the almanas, that it must be that it was conditional. That brings us to person number 2. Person number 2 was Rabbi Yossi Haglili. And says the Gemara, what did we learn about Rabbi Yossi Haglili at the top of the page? We learned that Rabbi Yossi Haglili had a problem with Rabbi Eliezer's shita. What was the problem with Rabbi Eliezer's shita? So it says the Gemara 3/4 of the way down. Ne'ene Rabbi Yossi Haglili v'amar. Heichan matzinu asr lazeh u'muter lazeh. Ha'asr asr lakol ve'hamuter muter lakol. Says the Gemara, his concern was, Rabbi Yossi Haglili's concern was, how can you have a scenario where she's free enough to marry most people but not some people? If the man is single, he's an eligible bachelor, there's no reason why she can't marry a particular person. So his problem with Rabbi Eliezer is that Rabbi Eliezer said you can marry everyone but one person. What's the precedence for that? That's not normal. Says the Gemara, Velo, what are you talking about? We have these kinds of distinctions in halacha almost every blot of Shas. How so? Says the Gemara, Truma v'kodshim sha'asura lazeh u'muteres lazeh. We know Truma and Kodshim are allowed for some people, but they're not for a Zari, not for a regular person. So it says the Gemara, I mean, you're right, but that's a little bit of a shver answer because I'm not talking about fruits and vegetables. Be'isr isha karmina. I'm talking about in regards to women. So that's where we should have a case scenario where if you're allowed, where a woman's allowed to marry one person, she should be allowed to marry any man. As long as they're a single man, she should be able to marry them. And if she's single, technically, even if that man is married, she could marry another man. So what's the restriction? Says the Gemara, we have some arayos, some women that you're allowed to marry, some women that you're not allowed to marry. You're allowed to marry your niece on one side, but not your niece on the other side. You can marry your brother's child. You can't marry your daughter's child. So the Gemara has a lot of these kinds of distinctions in Arayos. Says the Gemara, Be'ishus Karmin. I'm talking about in marriage. I'm not talking about in Arayos, different categories of people. We're saying if someone is marriageable, then you should be able to marry them. How could Rabbi Eliezer make a distinction? Says the Gemara, Hare Eishes Ish. You have a woman who's married. That's a type of person who's not allowed to marry other people. And therefore, we see that there are some people who are allowed to, who are marriageable, and some people who are not. And the Gemara says, Hainu Pircha. This then is the question against Rabbi Yossi Aglili, where we do see that there are some people who are allowed to marry and some people who are not. Shita number 2 has been raised and been dropped. We're no longer concerned about the Shita of Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Uvimai, what was Rabbi Yossi Aglili's understanding of Rabbi Eliezer? Was when Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah said the words Ella of Ella Leploni, is that Bachutz or is that Almanas? So says the Gemara, Uvimai. Ilema be'almanas. If you want to say that Rabbi Yossi Aglili's understanding of our Gemara is almanas, so hare hutra etzlo biznus. Had it been that she were to have slept with someone, that he were to have slept with someone biznus, that had he slept with someone biznus, so that would be bad, but it wouldn't be the fundamental problem. Only marriage is. Although it must be that it can't be almanas, rather bachutz. And then the Gemara turns to Rabbi Akiva. Now you'll note that the flow is off because in the beginning, Brisa, on the top of the page, first we presented Rabbi Tarfon, then Rabbi Yossi Aglili, then Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and then Rabbi Akiva. Now here we are out of order. We presented Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We skip Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah and we teach Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so the Gemara says 12 lines or so from the bottom, Ne'ene Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva had raised his concern. The Amar, remember the concern about mamzerus that we learned at the top of the page. This woman who was told that she can't marry Chaim, no problem. She went and she married David, and she had children with David. And then and then she became widowed, meaning David, the husband, the second husband died, Oniskarsha, or she and he divorced. And then she went and she married Chaim, the man that she's not supposed to marry. The Gemara said above in the name of Rabbi Akiva, and quotes it here again, Lo nimtza a get batel v'neha mamzerin. Don't we see a retroactive case of mamzerus, that because she didn't fulfill her tanai, so therefore the kids are now mamzerim, because let's remember again, she was married to Reuven. He said, Hareini miskareshes except for Chaim. She said, no problem, I'll go marry David. David divorced her. The only guy left was Chaim. She marries David retroactively 10 years ago. The get was dissolved. And that means that all the kids are mamzerim. That was what Rabbi Akiva said. So Hainu Pircha, that, sorry, I skipped a line. Skipped a couple of lines there. Wow. Says the Gemara, Ihachi, if it's true that this would be a case of mamzerus, where when the third husband is married, be'isr, retroactively the second husband and their children, the second husband's children are mamzerim. Ihachi, then it should be true, be'kulhu t'na'e de'alma, nami lo tinsiv. Then it should be the case that if there's any condition in regards to future marriages, she should not be allowed to get married. Because maybe 10 years from now, the condition will be fulfilled, and all of the children born to previous marriages will be mamzerim. Maybe perhaps she will not fulfill the conditions as they were stipulated. This rejects version 1.0 of Rabbi Akiva. We know, of course, there's a davar acher. We'll get there soon. But we've answered up for 3 of the 5 shitas. And this version of Rabbi Akiva was concerned about mamzerim. Uvemai, how does he understand our Mishnah, which speaks about Ella Leploni, that she's allowed to marry everyone except for person X? Is it bachutz or is it almanas? So says the Gemara, 7 lines from the bottom. Uvemai, ilema bachutz. If you want to say that it means bachutz, that it's just a fact on the ground that you're not allowed to marry, that's not a condition, you're just not allowed to marry this person, says the Gemara, that's really not simple, because Mishra Shari Rabbi Eliezer. Because as we saw in the version of Rabbi Tarfon, we know that that can't be the perspective here of Rabbi Akiva, because at the end of the day, there is a case scenario where Rabbi Eliezer is matir her to marry this person, Titania. Modahai Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Eliezer agreed in the following case. The Megarish es ishto, that for a man who divorces his wife, Amar lo, and he says to her, that you're allowed to marry anyone in the world except for Chaim. And then she went and married another person, so we see over here that Rabbi Eliezer is matir under certain circumstances. So it can't be that Rabbi Akiva thinks that the case of Rabbi Eliezer is bachutz. Ella, it must be, says the Gemara, that it's a case of almanas, that it's a case of it being a condition. And version 2.0 of Rabbi Akiva, Davar Acher, what did he say? Let's say that the Chaim, the man that she's not supposed to marry, is a Kohen, and the husband, Ruven, he dies. Lo nimtzeis, don't we have a case where she's an almana etzlo? She's an almana as it relates to the Kohen. Ugrusha etzel kol adam, and considered a divorcee as it relates to everybody else, says the Gemara, Bekal v'chomer. Uma grusha sheikala asura mishum tzad gerushin sheba, just like a grusha, which relatively speaking is a low level, there's no iser kares chenek, there's no major consequences. Just like in those cases, there's a tzad gerushin sheba. Eshes ish chamura lo kol shekain. Eshes ish, which is punishable by capital punishment, all the more so she should be restricted to people. So the Gemara says, uvemai, how do we understand Rabbi Akiva version 2.0? Within this version of Rabbi Akiva about this kal v'chomer, would he say that Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah is talking about bachutz or almanas? So says the Gemara, ilema be'almanas, if you want to say that what we're talking about is almanas, the Rabbi Eliezer in our Mishnah says it's conditional that she's not allowed to marry Chaim. Hare grusha etzlo biznus. So we had said earlier that there's a case of grusha etzlo biznus, and take a look at Rashi. Garsinan hare lo asra alav elalina, say that the only isser is in marriage. Aval iznus grusha hi etzlo. She's considered, if the Kohen were to have slept with this woman, if Chaim, the Kohen, were to have slept with this woman, it would not be considered anything more than znus. So therefore, it can't be almanas ella bachutz. Asks the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva is talking out of both sides of his mouth. In version 1.0 of Rabbi Akiva, he was talking about a case of almanas. He read Rabbi Eliezer in one way, which is almanas. And in the Davar Acher, in version 2.0 of Rabbi Akiva, he read it as bachutz. So Rabbi Akiva, ichutz, if Rabbi Eliezer is a chutz guy, if that's what our Mishnah means, svirale lo siv chutz, then that ichutz svirale, then lo siv chutz. I put my comma in the wrong place there. Ichutz svirale, if he holds Rabbi Eliezer is really a chutz guy, then lo siv chutz, and you should argue from a position of chutz that that's what he holds. V'i almanas svirale lo siv almanas. So the Gemara says the reason why Rabbi Akiva had to give two answers is because of the following. Pei Gimel Amud Beis. We're on 3 lines down now. We'll be stopping 4 or 5 lines before the wide lines. I'll just take a quick pause for a break. Tomorrow, we're not going to have shiur in person. Same with Wednesday. I'll be posting both days. Thursday, Mir Hashem, if my flights are on time, will be in person. If not, then I'll post earlier and I will keep you posted. So no shiur tomorrow or the next day. Mir Hashem back in person Thursday. So says the Gemara, how can Rabbi Akiva understand Rabbi Eliezer in 2 different ways? One, as our Mishnah, being a fact that you're simply not allowed to marry her, and the second being a condition that if you marry her, then the get is batel. So says the Gemara, Rabbi Akiva shmiale de'ika de amar chutz v'ika de amar la'almanas. There are those who say he knew what was going on. He knew there was a machlokes about the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. They were not clear about what he held. Maybe they didn't live at the same time. I don't know the time frame of Rabbi Eliezer. I don't know. I'm not sure. That was a good question as to why they didn't just ask, but they must not have overlapped. So Manda Amar Chutz Hai Pircha, Manda Amar Almanas Hai Pircha. So he said I had to come up with 2 approaches to reject Rabbi Eliezer. One was a Chutz approach, and one was an Almanas approach, because I had to make sure that I covered all of my bases with Rabbi Eliezer. Says the Gemara, Umay Pircha. What is the rejection of the Davar Acher? Says the Gemara, Inema Isser Kahuna Shiny. If you want to say that the reason why the Kal V'chomer isn't a good Kal V'chomer is because Kahuna is different. So Rabbi Eliezer Nami Me'Isser Kahuna Kamaisila. On Pei Beis, we saw that Rabbi Eliezer, when we were defining him, we saw that he brought a raya from the pasuk of Isha Grusha Me Isha Lo Yikachu, which is a pasuk all about Kohanim. So says the Gemara, Rava, the Shita of Rava, who said that all of the answers are rejectable, with the exception of Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah. He said, "Ki Rav Yanai mishum zaken echad kamasni." He held like Rav Yanai, which was not talking about kahuna, and therefore we can bring back the possibility that maybe Rabbi Akiva's case was only talking about a Kohen and therefore not a Raya against Rabbi Eliezer. Now let's go back to that cryptic line where Amar Lehen Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua looked back at all four people, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Lazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva. And he had said to them, Ein Meshivin es Ha'ari la'achar Misa. He had said, I don't accept any of your opinions. You can't fight with Rabbi Eliezer after he dies. He's a lion. You guys are a bunch of cubs. There's nothing to talk about. He's bigger than you. Leave it be. So says the Gemara, there's something odd about this. Lememra, does this imply to Rabbi Yoshua himself that it's kavase svirule? Remember, Rabbi Eliezer has this very difficult shita that if a husband puts into place a condition about the divorce, that she's muteres to everyone except for Chaim, he says that she's actually divorced and not allowed to marry Chaim. When Rabbi Yoshua says, everybody, you're not allowed to argue with Rabbi Eliezer because he's an Ari, does that mean that Rabbi Yoshua himself agrees that she's muteres to everybody except for Chaim? After all, he himself has some difficulties with the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. He is not kaftor uferach. He doesn't love everything that he's hearing from Rabbi Eliezer. So says the Gemara, Hachi ka'amar lehu. We're a quarter of the way down on Pei Gimel Amud Beis. Rabbi Yoshua, says back to all four Rabbanim, to Rabbi Tarfon, to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, to Rabbi Lazar ben Azar, and Rabbi Akiva, and he says, Hachi ka'amar lehu. This is really what I'm telling you. Lididina mi isli pircha. I also have difficulties with the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. His shita is very difficult. How can you put a condition into a get like that to say that you're muteres to everyone except for one person? It's not mistaber. She's not divorced. If you're restricting her from marrying one person, that's not krisus. Mihu bein lididi bein lididchu. Whether or not it's me or you, says Rabbi Yoshua, I know it's difficult. I agree with you, and it doesn't matter. Ein meshiv esari lachar misa. Respect. We're not fighting against Rabbi Eliezer. He is the Gadol Hador. We are, and I'm speaking about great people, we are lower than he is. Saying this about Rabbi Akiva feels uncomfortable, but they were kafuf to Rabbi Eliezer. And Rabbi Yoshua wouldn't hear about it. You guys got to stop. I agree with you. I don't understand it either. I agree. I don't have pshat. But we hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Says the Gemara, Umay pircha de Rabbi Yoshua. Says the Gemara, the Gemara had said a line ago that Rabbi Yoshua himself has a difficulty with the shita of Rabbi Eliezer. What is the challenge of the shita of Rabbi Eliezer according to Rabbi Yoshua? Says the Gemara de Tanya. This is a stark and simple balabatish argument found in a brisa. Why is it that we have a difficulty with the shita of Rabbi Eliezer? Let's review for the 10th time. Rabbi Eliezer says that if a husband stipulates you're free to marry anyone you want, with the exception of Chaim, that she's still divorced. Says the Gemara de Tanya, Amar Rabbi Yoshua, our Rabbi Yoshua, the same one who says that he's an Ari and you can't argue with him, he also had a problem with the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. What was his challenge? Makish kod mehavaya shnia, lekod mehavaya harishona. There has to be a comparison between the moment before she gets married for the second time and the moment she got married the first time. Ma kod mehavaya rishona. When a simple, regular, single girl gets engaged, she's not tethered to anybody else. She's good to go. She can get married. So too, it should also be the case of that when she gets married, it can't be that she's stuck and trapped that she can't marry another person. Rabbi Yeshua himself also says, Rabbi Eliezer, I don't understand you. I don't get it. It should be the case that when a woman gets married, she's clean and free to marry whoever she wants. It's mutter for her to marry. The husband, the megaresh, can't stipulate that she can't marry Chaim. That's not a divorce. That's not krisus. It has to be that when someone's getting married, that they're allowed to marry anyone that is legal for them to marry. You can't put this rule into place. We therefore see the Rabbi Yoshua himself, even though he says outright that our shitas mean nothing. Bein l'didi, bein l'didchu, no matter what, we have to paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. It's true, but Rabbi Yeshua still has a hard time with Rabbi Eliezer's shita. Says the Gemara, Gufa, we had learned twice in the Brisas at the bottom of Pei Gimel Amud Aleph, we had learned as follows. We had learned Moda Rabbi Eliezer b'megarish es ishto, that there was a case scenario where Rabbi Eliezer would agree that a woman was allowed to marry this Chaim, the man that the husband wouldn't allow to marry. In a case where a husband was megaresh es ishav amar Allah, he says to her, Harat muteres l'chol adam chutz l'ploni. You could marry anyone you want with the exception of Chaim. And then she married another random guy, and she was then widowed or divorced. No kids were born. Then she's allowed to marry Chaim. Says the Gemara, Hey Reb Shimon ben Elazar, Bar Elazar, Tshuva l'dibri Rabbi Eliezer. He says, I don't understand. Hey Chan Matzinu shezeh oser v'zeh matir.
Wouldn't he be in the other guy's brothers?
Only if there are brothers. Obviously, you have to build the case that the Gemara is presenting a case that allows her to marry. Of course, there's no brothers in this case. Otherwise, for sure, that would be a complicating factor. But usually in halacha, when we're trying to analyze a case, you could ask that question, but it's not the right question. What?
It doesn't hold?
It's just not the right question. The Gemara is creating a pristine scenario to test the limits of halacha. So here, what Rabbi Eliezer was saying is that if this woman got married to David in the marketplace, they had no kids. They were married for an hour. It was a bad marriage, bad idea.
Right.
Then they go straight to Bezdin and divorce. Then she's allowed to marry Chaim. If she has brothers, of course the case would change. Pashut. So it's obvious from the Gemara that that's not there. So then Reb Shimon bar Elazar says there's a tshuva l'dibri Reb Elazar. He says something that's difficult. I don't understand. What is the precedent? How, listen to this. How can we have it be the case that the Megaresh, Ruvain, is the one who creates the Isser on Chaim? And when she divorces husband number 2, or more accurately, when husband number 2 divorces her, when David divorces her, what ends up happening? She can then marry Chaim. How does that?
Because there's no kids, right?
Because there's no kids, for sure. Otherwise, the kids would be a mamzerim, which is still difficult to say.
Right.
But those cases are so one another. That requires Rishonim. That's not for us. So says the Gemara, where's the precedence where the Megaresh makes it usher for her to marry Chaim, but David, when she divorces Rachel, makes it mutter for her to marry Chaim? Says the Gemara, Velo, we have precedents like this all over Shas. Says the Gemara, V'harei Yavama de Baal oser v'yava matir. Yavama, that becomes usher to other people by the Baal, and the Yavam can be matir that. By that, then she's allowed to get married to the Yavam. So says the Gemara, Hasam Yavam hu ka'asar la. You're right, the Yavam was the one who made it asar. De'imi Baal hasharya v'kaima. Had it been that it was from the husband, then hasharya v'kaima, she would have been totally fine. It was not the husband who made her asar. It was the Yavam who made her asar. Otherwise, without there being a brother, this was what you were asking in the other case. Had there not been a brother, it's the Yavam that makes her asur. It's not the husband that makes her asur to other people. It's the Yavam. So therefore, that's not a question. Says the Gemara, fine. Harei nedarim the noder oser v'chacha matir. If I make a neder, I make something asur on myself. Then I go to Bezdin. They're matir what I did. Says the Gemara, no. Amar Rabbi Yochanan ein chacha matir klum ela b'charata. I'm the one who brought it upon myself. And I'm the one who undoes it with charata. Yes, granted, in the presence of a bezdin. But this is also a case where we see these two scenarios. Harei hafaras habal, the isha, no deres, ubal mefer. We have the case of hafaras habal, where a husband is able to undo the neder of a wife. Who started it? She did. The isha no deres. She took a neder that she's never going to sleep in a bed, whatever the case may be. The Baal says, sorry, no start, nothing, non-starter. So who started it? She did. Who ended it? He did. So says the Gemara. That's another case of precedent. Says the Gemara, no. Hasam kidei Rav Pinchas mishmei de Rava. The Amar Rav Pinchas mishmei de Rava. Kol hanu deres al das baila hino deres. That when a woman makes a neder, she does so al das baila, and therefore it's all within the umbrella of the husband. When she made the neder in the first place, it was only binding or not binding because of the husband. Now, we omitted something on the bottom of the last page. When we were analyzing all of the shitas that argued with Rabbi Eliezer, we had said that there were 5 shitas. We learned Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili. We learned Rabbi Elazar ben. We learned what is it? Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Akiva A, Rabbi Akiva B, and we skipped one. We skipped Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And remember that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah was the only one that was irrefutable. His argument was actually good. Now we're going to analyze that one. 2/3 of the way down. Ne'ene Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah ve'amar krisus davar hakores beino leveina. He takes, we're calling it simple. He's a Tana. I don't mean to minimize, but the simplest approach is this is not called krisus. Rabbi Eliezer, when you say that she's allowed to marry anyone in the universe except for Chaim, that's not called krisus. Krisus is when you're done with her, not when you still have a cloud over her head. Very glatt, very simple. So says the Gemara, Krisus. Says the Gemara, this was our case scenario where there was no refutation. This was the strongest and only standing argument against Rabbi Eliezer. So it's a machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. And Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says to Rabbi Eliezer, although he didn't say this to him because they weren't alive at the same time that this conversation happened, he says, "You're not making sense. There's no krisus there if she's still not allowed to marry Chaim." And if that's true, then that means that the word krisus teaches us that. And if so, v'Rabbanan, what did the other shitas hold? If you hold that krisus is limiting and therefore you can't have Chaim, you can't have a restriction. So how does this work? Ha-krisus, my avdile. What does the word krisus mean? Because according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's meant to hold a cloud. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, that's not krisus. So therefore, it must be that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Eliezer holds me boy lehu lichadatanya. It must be that all of the other rabbis, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, and Rabbi Tarfon, that they all hold lichadatanya. If a man says that you're never going to drink wine, that you won't go to my father's house, the din is ein ze krisus, but shloshim yom harei ze krisus. According to all of the other Tanaim, they say that the reason for the word krisus is to teach us that 30 days is when it's 30 days and less is called krisus. 31 days and more is not called krisus. If your condition breaks 30 days, you're in violation of krisus. Then you're not divorced. You're allowed to put in a short-term stipulation. And that's what the word krisus means. And that's why they don't learn like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. V'idach, what would Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah say back to them? Says the Gemara, Mikares krisus nafka. He says, nah, I learned that out because really the Torah just should have said the chasavla sefer krisus. It could have just said chasavla sefer kares. Why does the Torah call krisus? To teach us that you can have two implications. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, we learn two things from the word krisus. Number one, we learn that krisus is davar hakoris beino lebeina, and if you put a condition in, like Rabbi Eliezer did, it doesn't work. And also that there's a 30-day condition limit before krisus kicks in. And the idach, says the Gemara, that the Rabbanan would argue back to that kares krisus lo darshi. The fact that the word krisus is written a little bit longer than it should have been, those extra letters are not room for a drasha. And therefore, there is no machlokas between them on that nekuda. We're going to stop right here. I'll record tomorrow's shiur and post for you in Yirtzeh Hashem in the early morning hours. And Wednesday, I'll do the same early morning hours. And then in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll pick up on Thursday in person. Wishing you all a beautiful night.